Music. An ordinary morning in California, or the beginning of a media earthquake that threatens to shatter a carefully constructed public facade? This is the question hanging in the air as new revelations from Tom Bower suddenly dominate the headlines. What initially seems like just another chapter in the endless celebrity drama quickly develops into a serious crisis with political, media, and economic repercussions. At the center is Meghan Markle, her name once again linked to accusations, rumors, and explosive details that she apparently would have preferred to keep hidden. According to reports, the information spreads at breakneck speed. Within hours, international media outlets pick up the story, social networks explode, and commentators are already calling it one of the most intense tests of confidence since the move to California. The core of the debate: new statements, new background information, and old stories, music, suddenly appear in a different light. To observers, it seems as if long-suppressed questions are now forcefully surfacing. The starting point of this dynamic is the renewed attention on Tom Bower, a journalist known for his uncompromising methods. His previous publications had already caused considerable unrest. But this time the impact seems even more immediate. Shortly after the new material becomes public, it's clear that it not only reopens old wounds but also challenges existing narratives. This applies not only to public appearances but also to the portrayal of personal lives. Particularly striking is how quickly the focus narrows to Meghan Markle. Observers note that the tone of the reporting has changed. Less admiration, more skepticism. Instead of familiar buzzwords like new beginning or authenticity, terms like control, staging, and contradictions suddenly dominate. This shift is precisely what makes the situation so explosive, as it strikes at the heart of public perception. Harry, too, is inevitably drawn into the maelstrom of events. While he isn't at the center of the revelations, his name is regularly mentioned in connection with the current developments. Analysts point out that earlier promises of a quieter life, far removed from the old structures, are now harder to defend. Instead of distance from the media frenzy, a state of constant scrutiny seems to have returned. The news value of this situation stems not only from new details but also from the timing. The revelations coincide with a period in which previous projects have lost their luster and economic questions are growing louder. This is precisely where many commentaries begin. Is this just another media storm or a turning point that will determine how resilient the existing image truly is? Furthermore, former associates, supporters, and even critics are suddenly finding an audience again. Their statements, comparisons, and recollections are being discussed anew, often with the observation that certain aspects of the past have received little attention until now. For the media, this is a godsend, as every new perspective reinforces the impression that much remains to be said. At the end of this first section, one key insight emerges. The current situation is more than a snapshot. It marks the beginning of an intensive examination of the past, its portrayal, and its credibility. Music. Whether this will develop into merely a short-term controversy or a long-term reassessment remains to be seen. But the crucial question is already here. Is this just another celebrity drama, or the beginning of a fundamental re-evaluation of one of the most prominent figures of recent years? Why are the current revelations having such an explosive effect? The answer lies primarily in the person who brought them to light. Tom Bower has been known for years as a journalist who isn't satisfied with superficial accounts. His name stands for thorough research, long-term observation, and a willingness to publish even uncomfortable details. When he dedicates himself to a topic, it's rarely casually, but rather with the aim of systematically questioning existing narratives. It is precisely this reputation that now amplifies the significance of the new publications. Observers point out that Bower is not known for short-term sensationalism, but for meticulously gathered information. This ensures that his statements are taken more seriously in media circles than many other reports. As a result, self-absorbed individuals who previously showed little interest in royal or celebrity conflicts are beginning to take a closer look. Music. At the center of this renewed attention is once again Meghan Markle. Bauer paints a picture that deviates significantly from the public image conveyed over the years. It's less about individual accusations and more about patterns that allegedly run through different phases of her life. Commentators speak of a systematic analysis rather than isolated criticism, which further increases the pressure. Bauer's linking of past events with current developments is particularly sensitive. This creates the impression of a continuous line stretching from her early career years to the present day. Media experts emphasize that this long-term perspective is precisely what makes the difference. Those who criticize individual episodes quickly risk being seen as biased. However, those who reveal connections over years force the public to reflect. Harry also appears regularly in this context, albeit more as part of the inner circle than as a central figure. Nevertheless, his name is mentioned in analyses, especially when it comes to joint decisions and public appearances. The question of how much the two are perceived as a single entity is thus gaining renewed importance. For many observers, individual responsibilities are becoming blurred, which increases the pressure on both. Another factor is their media history. Bauer's previous publications had already demonstrated his willingness to challenge established power structures. His revisiting topics considered closed now seems like a deliberate signal. The story is not yet over. This very stance is prompting newsrooms worldwide to react and launch their own investigations. Added to this is the speed with which the content spreads. Within a very short time, analyses, commentaries, and opinion pieces appear that pick up on or expand upon Bauer's theses. The focus is increasingly shifting from the author himself to the consequences of his statements. What does all this mean for the public image of Meghan Markle? And how reliable are the narratives presented so far? It is also striking that the tone of many reports has changed. Where restraint or cautious phrasing once dominated, more explicit assessments now prevail. Some commentators are openly speaking of a turning point, while others warn against jumping to conclusions. But even these cautions are only fueling the debate. In conclusion, it's important to remember that the impact of these revelations is inextricably linked to the source. Tom Bauer is not merely a chronicler, but a catalyst for a broader discussion about credibility, image, and public responsibility. The crucial question now is, will this dynamic lead to a lasting reassessment, or will those involved manage to contain the resulting doubts? With these new revelations, a period long considered closed is now in focus. Meghan Markle's early career in Hollywood. What was previously told as a classic story of an actress's arduous rise to fame now appears considerably more complex. Media analyses suggest that certain milestones of this period are being re-evaluated because they are no longer viewed in isolation, but rather as part of a larger context. The central question is how professional opportunities actually arose at that time. Observers point out that Hollywood is an environment where talent alone is rarely enough. Music, networks, personal relationships, and strategic decisions play a crucial role. This is precisely where the current reports come in. They paint a picture in which individual career steps progressed more quickly and smoothly than was later portrayed in many interviews. This discrepancy is fueling growing skepticism. The fact that old associates are suddenly being mentioned again is particularly explosive. Names appear and then disappear from the news. But the impression remains. There were people who played a role for a time and later hardly appeared at all. Commentators interpret this as an indication that relationships were reassessed based on their usefulness. This is a sensitive issue for public perception because it touches on fundamental questions of loyalty and authenticity. The timeline of individual events is also now being examined more closely. Media outlets are comparing earlier statements with more recent accounts and noting differences that are not always easy to explain. Sometimes certain phases seem abbreviated, sometimes others appear overemphasized. These shifts are what provide fertile ground for speculation, because as soon as the timeline no longer seems clear, doubt about the entire narrative grows. Furthermore, the Hollywood years were often portrayed as the foundation for his later public role. They were seen as proof of perseverance and independence. If precisely this foundation is now being called into question, the consequences are far-reaching. Analysts emphasize that it's less about individual roles or projects, and more about the overall image that has emerged. If this image becomes fragile, everything built upon it also begins to crumble. In this context, Harry reappears on the periphery of the news coverage. While the revelations primarily concern the time before their relationship, many commentators are asking how much this past later influenced their joint decisions. The transition from an acting career to a global public role was abrupt, and this very breaking point is now being examined more closely. The media reaction shows how sensitive the topic is, while some voices urge caution, pointing out that careers rarely follow a linear path, while others see the new information as confirmation of long-held doubts. Particularly on social media, the past is being dissected piece by piece. Old interviews are being republished and commented on. This reinforces the impression that nothing can be taken for granted anymore. At the end of this section, a central theme takes shape. Meghan Markle's Hollywood past is no longer seen merely as backstory, but as the key to understanding the present. The more details are discussed, the more pressing the question becomes whether the established narrative was complete or deliberately simplified. The crucial question therefore remains: are these simply the normal ambiguities of a long career, or are they deliberate adjustments now coming to light? With the renewed public discussion, the focus noticeably shifts from external accusations to internal mechanisms. Observers are increasingly analyzing how strongly the need for control may have shaped Meghan Markle's public persona. Media commentaries emphasize that her handling of criticism and opposition was characterized less by composure than by an attempt to control her own narrative down to the last detail. It is precisely this approach that is now being called into question. The more details emerge, the more frequently the term loss of control appears. Analysts see this as a decisive turning point. As long as public appearances, interviews, and projects appear carefully coordinated, the image remains stable. But as soon as external voices emerge with new information, this order can no longer be fully maintained. At that moment, uncertainty and mistrust arise not only among the public but apparently also within their immediate circle. It is particularly striking that the reporting is increasingly characterized by emotionally charged terms. Words like panic, tension, and crisis mode dominate many articles. They paint a picture of a situation in which familiar strategies no longer work. For someone whose public presence has been highly curated, this represents a considerable burden. Media psychologists point out that such a scenario often leads to internal tensions because decisions have to be made under pressure. Harry is also mentioned again in this context. Although his role remains rather indirect, commentators see the current situation as a test for their collective presence. The previous strategy of presenting a united front and jointly deflecting criticism seems more difficult under the new circumstances. The more the focus is on individual aspects of the past, the more joint appearances come under pressure to justify themselves. Added to this is the question of trust. The fact that detailed information from earlier phases of someone's life is being leaked to the public is fueling speculation about possible sources. Media outlets are reporting a growing climate of mistrust, in which former companions, colleagues, and even supporters are viewed critically. This suspicion intensifies inner turmoil because it creates the feeling of having lost control not only over one's image but also over one's environment. In the public perception, this shifts the focus from concrete accusations to structural questions. How resilient is an image that relies heavily on self-presentation? And what happens when this self-presentation is challenged by external investigations? These are precisely the questions driving the debate and ensuring that the story doesn't fizzle out but rather gains in intensity. Music. It is also striking that former supporters are increasingly silent. Where previously there were swift defenses and expressions of solidarity, there is now reticence. Communication researchers interpret this as a sign of growing uncertainty. Silence itself becomes a message, signaling that even well-intentioned observers can no longer discern a clear line of reasoning. At the end of this section, a clear picture emerges. The loss of complete control over one's own narrative acts as a catalyst for further problems. What was once considered a strength the ability for precise self-management, now reverses itself. The crucial question therefore remains open. Can a public image under pressure be stabilized or even strengthened? In the end, everyone is only trying to create the impression of insecurity. Parallel to the escalating media coverage, economic aspects are increasingly coming to the fore. Observers note that the current revelations cannot be viewed in isolation, but rather coincide with a period in which previous projects had already lost their luster. This very overlap makes the situation particularly critical. When public doubt and economic uncertainties occur simultaneously, they reinforce each other. At the heart of the discussion is the question of the long-term viability of the established brand. For years, Meghan Markle was perceived not only as a personality but also as a project. Collaborations, media formats, and strategic partnerships were seen as expressions of a new, independent path. But recently, reports of a lack of success, reduced attention, and waning interest have become increasingly frequent. The new revelations act as an additional burden in this context. Analysts point out that public credibility and economic success are closely linked. As soon as doubts about authenticity arise, markets and partners react sensitively. Brands want stability, reliability, and a positive environment, especially when uncertainty prevails and decisions are re-evaluated. This dynamic now seems to be taking hold, further exacerbating the situation. Harry is also mentioned in this context, as many projects were always perceived as joint ventures. Public perception rarely distinguishes between individual responsibilities but rather evaluates the overall picture. This puts both parties under increased pressure, even if individual accusations do not apply equally to them. The public gets the impression of a system that has stalled overall. Furthermore, the earlier promise of a financially independent fresh start is now being critically examined. Commentators are asking whether expectations were set too high or whether strategic errors were made. Many articles emphasize that the transition from institutional support to complete self-reliance is more complex than initially assumed. Current events seem to confirm this assessment. The shift in tone in media coverage is particularly striking. While optimistic forecasts dominated previously, skepticism now prevails. Terms like stagnation and realignment appear with increasing frequency. They suggest that a turning point may have been reached, necessitating fundamental decisions. For public perception, this represents a further shift from an image of new beginnings to a question of survival. This development is being intensely discussed on social media. Users compare earlier announcements with the current situation and draw their own conclusions. This reveals how closely image and economic success are intertwined. Every new piece of information is immediately evaluated in terms of its potential consequences, further increasing the pressure. The conclusion of this section is that economic challenges and media revelations fuel each other. As a result, the crisis no longer appears as a short-term episode, but as a structural problem. The open question remains: will a clear realignment succeed in regaining lost trust, or does this phase mark the beginning of a permanent loss of significance? As the debate continues, family ties are increasingly coming into focus. Observers note that personal relationships have a particular impact on public perception because they are considered a measure of credibility. This is precisely why the discussions surrounding Thomas Markle and Samantha Markle are gaining importance. What long appeared to be a private matter is now being interpreted as part of a larger picture. The previously dominant narrative presented family rifts as a clear consequence of external circumstances. However, current reports paint a more nuanced picture. Media analyses suggest that conflicts were more complex than public accounts indicated. This is less about assigning blame than about how stories were told and which aspects were emphasized. This reassessment is causing unease because it challenges a familiar narrative. The role of Thomas Markle is particularly sensitive. His earlier presence in the news was often reduced to isolated incidents. Now, however, his significance is being renegotiated within the context of the entire story. Commentators are asking whether certain accounts were oversimplified and whether family tensions might have been mutual. This question alone is changing the perspective of many observers. Meghan also reappears in this context. Her public reactions are receiving increased attention because they seem to confirm existing doubts or at least reinforce them. The media points out that family voices, even if controversial, have a particularly strong impact in times of crisis. They lend the debate a personal dimension that is difficult to control. These developments coincide with a period in which public patience is noticeably waning. Analysts observe that the public is increasingly less willing to accept complex explanations without question. Instead, the desire for clarity is growing. This is precisely where the dilemma lies. The more details are discussed, the more difficult it becomes to draw a clear line. Every new piece of information raises further questions. Harry, too, remains part of this equation. His position between loyalty, publicity, and personal distance is being intensely debated. Commentators see this as a source of tension that not only shapes the current situation but could also influence future decisions. The idea of a fresh start together is increasingly fraught with uncertainty. By the end of this section, the impression is growing that the debate has long since transcended individual accusations. It has evolved into a fundamental confrontation with the past, its portrayal, and public responsibility. The crucial question now is, can trust, once shattered, be rebuilt through new narratives? Or will the shadow of the past remain permanently? The current debate surrounding Meghan Markle demonstrates how quickly public perception can shift when new information collides with old stories. Starting with Tom Bower's revelations, a dynamic developed within a short time that goes far beyond a typical celebrity drama. Previous career phases, personal relationships, and economic expectations were reassessed and placed in a broader context. The shift in tone of the reporting is particularly striking. Where once a new beginning and self-determination were emphasized, doubt and skepticism now dominate. The discussions surrounding control, image, and authenticity illustrate how fragile public narratives can be when under pressure. At the same time, they demonstrate how closely economic success and credibility are intertwined. The inclusion of familial aspects further amplified this development. Names like Thomas Markle and Samantha Markle became symbols of a debate that intertwines personal and public spheres. Harry, too, remains part of this narrative because joint decisions and public appearances are not perceived separately. The conclusion is not a final judgment, but rather an open-ended outlook. The story remains in flux, and its impact depends on how credible future steps are perceived. Will it be possible to rebuild trust and clearly define one's own role? Or does this phase mark the beginning of a permanent reassessment? The answer remains open, and therein lies the enduring tension.